So, hi all, good evening. I'm This is Sai Sharangadas, PMRF for your PMRFTA for your transport phenomena in biological systems. And this week we are going to last 3 weeks we were looking at diffusion, the fundamentals in a deep way. Now we are going to start to look at the other aspects of biological phenomena. One of which is momentum flux, under which comes rheology. And yeah, since nobody is in the call here, we will wait for another 15 minutes for the queue to assemble, and then I'll start my session after that. All right, so let's start with our presentation. So let's try and understand what is viscosity, right? Viscosity is the ability of a substance to impede the uh, it can be considered as a measure of the resistance of a fluid to flow through, flow from one point to another uh, due to an induced force. And for the best way to think about viscosity is if you look at honey. If you pour honey versus when you pour water, you can see the difference in the flow patterns. Honey flows much more slowly, whereas water flows freely, and that's the difference between that's an effect of the viscosity of the respective fluids. Honey is uh, honey is more viscous than water. Now, viscosity is defined for a fluid. Fluids could be compressible versus incompressible. Do you know? Do you know what is the difference between compressible versus incompressible fluids? Have you come across this? I'll give you a minute to think about it, or even Google it, and these could be better if these were interactive. I could give you more time to think about it, and then I could see how each people look at when they are thrown some jargons. This is not even a jargon. When they are thrown some words that are incomprehensible to them, um, it would be great to see how people react to it. But well, you can't have everything in life now, can you? So I'll give you a minute, then I'll give you the answer. All right. So typically, a fluid is compressible when it is in the liquid form, and when it is in the gaseous form, and when it is called an incompressible fluid when it is in a liquid form. Now, what is the difference? The difference is this. Now, when you constrain the space of a gas, if you take a volume of gas and try to constrain its space, the gas molecules tend to come together, or the average gap between each given molecule can change, significantly, relatively significantly when compared to that of liquids. Now, when you take the same liquid and if you try to constrain them, you cannot do it over and above a certain point, because the liquids by themselves are already um, um held by packed relatively more tightly than the gases. And if you think about it, it's called as a cohesive force that acts upon that keeps a liquid. And why this is so, how this is so, these are all questions of thermodynamic, which requires certain understanding of thermodynamic parameters. I leave the readers to, or the viewers to, think about it freely. But suffice to say that a gas is compressible, whereas water or any form of liquid is typically not. It's an incompressible fluid. Now, there is a relationship between the compressibility of a fluid and the effect of the temperature on the same, and we would get to that in a minute. Not in a minute, and sometime it's actually a part of the problem set. So, hello, Suluka. இல்லக்கா நான் மீட்டிங்ல இருக்கேன்க்கா. Bye. So, and then finally there are certain things that are called as Newtonian versus non-Newtonian fluids. I'll just come to it a bit later. In fact, I think, yeah, we'll come to it shortly. Now, what is the fundamental basis of viscosity? Now, why does certain fluids tend to flow faster than the others? That is the question that we are asking. For that, consider this as a pipe, or the boundaries of a pipe or boundaries of any system in which a fluid is flowing. Let's assume water for now. Now, uh, if the downward uh, part of the pipe, or the downward plate, or instead of thinking of this as a pipe, think of this as a two-dimensional plate in which water is flowing, and in fact, think of it as a cuboidal pipe that is not circular, but it's in the form of a cuboid. Now, if you take the base of the cuboid and move it in a slow enough velocity, what they are saying is this whole continuum of fluid, right, liquid, which is water, it can be divided into infinitesimally smaller pieces of the same. So in the previous lecture, we talked about we talked about a huge volume of water, relatively huge volume of water, a liter or two of water in a jar, and slicing out a volume element which is infinitesimally small. So think about this as a volume, a huge volume of water, and think of it as subdivided into volume elements within that volume itself. So this volume of water contains, uh, volume elements typically tending to infinity. Now, let's say that we move the base of the cuboid in a at a velocity slow enough so that the volume element that is immediately above this base of the cuboid moves along with the uh, base. Now shear this movement of this volume element results in this is a continuum, right? Now nothing works in isolation. So when this volume element moves, it automatically has an effect on the volume element above it, which will have an effect on on the volume element above it, so on and so forth. Basically what it means is that every volume element will start moving because of the base starting to move, but the velocity at each successive volume element will be incrementally smaller because the force exerted by the base of the cuboid on the bottommost volume element is uh, uh, is the highest, and at the topmost it is 0. Now let me repeat this to you again if you did not kind of Get it? You should now have gotten to the point of subdividing this volume of water into infinitely small pieces of volume elements. Now assume that the bottommost part of the volume element moves in the x direction. That means that since the volume elements, there is no spacing in between the volume elements, that means that automatically the volume elements above the volume element above the bottommost volume element starts to move, and because of that the next volume element, the third volume element above, first second third volume element above will start to move. But the point is, the force exerted on the bottommost volume element is the highest because it is directly being moved by the moving base of the cuboid. The movement of the successive volume elements are just movements because of the force exerted by the volume element below it. Think about it this way: the volume element, the velocity of the volume element t plus 1 is because of the velocity of the volume element t. um, it will incrementally slow down, and at the top of the immobile um, ceiling of the cuboid, there will be no uh, velocity. So this this phenomenon, or this force exerted on a volume element or another volume element, is called as the shear stress, and the shear stress is related to the shear rate, or before coming to the shear rate, this shear stress, right, the force exerted by the nth volume element on the n plus 1th volume element should be a function of the rate at which the base of the cuboid moves, right? The faster it moves, the faster should be the movement in the volume elements also. That makes intuitive sense. So this rate of volume, the rate of movement of of a given volume element is called as a shear rate. It is denoted by dvx by dy, and it should be now obvious to you why that is the case, but regardless, let me just explain it to you. It is a rate of change of the velocity of the volume element, of the velocity of a volume element at a point x with respect to change in the volume change in the distance y. Now why it is dv by dy, let me explain. Now the force from the base of the cuboid is exerted in the x direction, correct? However, the force exerted by one volume element on its successive volume elements above it is in the y direction. That is, the force is acting in a perpendicular direction, an orthogonal direction, when compared to the applied force. So that is why it is dvx by dy and not dvx by dx. And that's why the shear stress tau is given as not as tau x, but is given as tau yx. And this equation was derived experimentally by Einstein, and it's called as Einstein's theory, Einstein's equation of for viscosity. And the proportionality constant that relates the shear stress with the shear rate is called as the viscosity, which is given by the letter mu. Now why is this sign negative? Now think about it. That is also a part of the question. I'm just going to give you some time to just stare at this slide, so that you understand the the graphical meaning of this equation through this diagram. It's a very simple correlation. Of course, during the course of these lectures you will be going through many complex systems, but here we are more interested in building the fundamentals. Once you get the fundamentals right, you will get everything else right. So I'm going to pause here for some time, and you guys think about it. The relationship between shear stress and the shear rate. So in other words, what this says is, given a velocity profile of the lowermost volume element that is immediately above the base of the cuboid that is moving, given a shear stress, what is the shear rate? Or given a shear rate, what is the shear stress? These are all interrelated things, but the point that connects both of them is viscosity. If the viscosity is lower for a given shear rate, or for a given shear stress, the shear rate will be higher, and for a given for a highly viscous medium, that will not be the case. The shear rate will be lower, which means that given let's say if we take two liquids and move the two different liquids with different viscosities, and move the base of the cuboid, keep them in the same cuboid, everything, all dimensions is same, and move the bottommost the base of the cuboid at the same velocity, and divide it into equal pieces of infinite semi elements, which means that the bottommost infinite semi element will have the same relatively same velocity. However, the transmission of this velocity in the y direction, which is the shear rate, correct? If you think about it, the transmission of this shear stress the transmission of this velocity through the the continuum of the fluid will be easier for the uh, medium with low for the fluid with lower viscosity, and it will be a bit tougher for the fluid with the higher, relatively tougher for the fluid with high viscosity. That is why uh, um, we have thought about this theoretically. Now let's take assume that so we are saying that we are moving the base, but think about this now. You have a jar of water and a jar of honey, and you just open, tilt both at the same angle. There is only gravity working, no other force. Now if you think about it, the less viscous fluid will flow faster than the more viscous fluid, correct? So here the same shear stress is applied, but the shear rate is different. Um, in other words, the transmission of velocity from the base, the transmission of velocity through the continuum of the fluid honey is slower than the transmission of velocity in water in the in the y direction. Now you are tilting it. Now there will be vectors, cos theta, sin theta, etc., etc. But don't think about all those things. I just want to give you an intuitive sense of what this means. So I think we have dwelled enough on this. Now let's go to the next slide. So I'm sure people who have gone through the initial lectures of the um, the NPTEL lectures, they will understand, what is a Newtonian versus a non-Newtonian fluid. So it's very simple, actually. So this is the y-axis represents the shear stress and the x-axis represents the shear rate. And for a given shear stress, if the shear rate changes linearly with time, linearly, it is called as a Newtonian fluid. We have a straight line, beautiful straight line here, right? So water and typically all kinds of fluids that we have in biological, not all kinds of fluids, most of the fluids under the conditions under typical conditions are near Newtonian fluids. But there are other types of fluids also. Let's see, let's see what they are. So there's called as a Bingham plastic fluid, and then the Power Law class of fluids. Now let's look at the Bingham plastic fluids. So what happens is that for in Bingham plastic fluids is that there is a threshold shear stress below which there is no change in the velocity profile of the uh, volume elements. So what that means is, let's say we are moving this the base of the cuboid, let's say very slowly for a Bingham plastic. That means that there is no transmission of velocity in the y direction. Um, why that is? That is because of the nature of the fluid. But above that threshold, the fluid behaves more or less like a Newtonian fluid. So if you think about it graphically, if you see here, there is an intercept here. So this intercept, what is this intercept? What is the what is this? What is the distance, the distance between the origin and the intercept? What that is? See, just a few people, just one or two people, the class would be really interesting. You're missing out. What to do? So what is the difference? What does this distance from the origin imply, or what is the intercept here? The intercept here is basically the threshold shear stress above which the there is a change in the shear rate. So or there is a transmission in the velocity of velocity in the y direction through the continuum of the fluid via the uh, volume elements. I'm telling you this again. Over a threshold, there will be a transmission. Below the threshold, there will be no transmission of velocity from the bottommost volume element through the fluid to the other layers of the fluid. And once the threshold of a shear stress is surpassed, which means that the base is moving rather faster. That means that at that point of time, there is a transmission of the velocity there's a transmission of the from of the velocity or there's a transmission of the velocity component in the y direction to each of the successive um, you know um, volume elements of the fluid in the y direction. So that is a Bingham plastic. What is the power law? Um, Power law equation. I mean, power law fluid is simply it's so a power law fluid is that once the um, shear stress increases over a threshold, um, this is a power law fluid where okay, all right, I gave you out one question. That's fine. I can frame another anytime. This is one type of a power law fluid, and this is another type of a power law fluid. One is called as dialent, and one is called as pseudoplastic. So it's simple. A power law is something where the graph scales in a near exponential manner. So if you see this graph, and when you compare it with either a Bingham plastic or that of a Newtonian fluid, you can see clearly that it is at least parabolic, if not exponential, which means that over a threshold of shear stress, or over a threshold of yeah, we can say that over a threshold of shear stress, the shear rate starts to increase substantially, or in other words, the viscosity of the fluid starts to come down. And in the case of pseudoplastic fluids, the reverse happens. The viscosity of the fluid increases. Actually, just a second. Well, yeah. Um, in the case of the dialent, I was right. I know the viscosity the viscosity increases decreases after a certain point of time. Here the at a certain threshold it starts to taper off. Um, um, you know uh, the way it is given in this graph, it means that the viscosity starts to um, cool off. It starts to become nearly constant, but it is called as a shear thickening fluid, uh, and this is a shear thinning fluid. Here the viscosity increases. Here the viscosity, or the apparent viscosity,